Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and today we're going to talk about a Ranger season that's kind of a big deal. You could probably tell that much from my chosen title, and while some might see said title as hyperbole meant to further bolster a great season, over these next 2, maybe 3 videos, I'll explain why it's probably the most accurate way to describe everything that In Space is and everything that In Space represents. But before we get into the season proper, we need to discuss how this franchise got to the point where it needed saving in the first place. So, surprising absolutely nobody, Turbo put our franchise in sort of a rough spot. This wasn't entirely Turbo's fault, however, as I'll explain. The fact of the matter is that by this point, Rangers as a concept was around the 4-year mark. 3 seasons of Mighty Morphin, 1 forgettable 10-episode sub-season, and then 1 season of Zeo. Even if you ignored the fact that the characters carried over most of the time, you'd still have a butt-ton of similar feeling one-and-done episode trajectories. Make no mistake, there are still plenty of great episodes in all of those seasons. Most of those seasons, but when your seasons are 40 or 50 plus episodes with no larger story to start and finish, things can get pretty stale. When it comes right down to it, Turbo wasn't that much of a drop-off compared to what preceded it, but by the time it came out, we had seen it all before, and the only truly novel things they could add were car-based Zords that a lot of people didn't like, and a Kid Ranger that even fewer people liked. I thought Justin was just fine though, honestly, nothing special but nothing egregiously offensive either. Simply put, Turbo is where the novelty of Rangers started to wear thin, and the issues started to become more and more apparent. That might also be a case of early adopters of the franchise, like me, having grown up a bit since '93. I was still watching, of course, but many of us simply weren't anymore, especially since by the mid to late 90s, Dragon Ball Z, Pokemon, Sailor Moon, amongst other things, became really big things, shows that were essential to the wave of Western anime embrace. So anyone that wanted to watch monsters or people fight each other had a couple of hot new alternatives. So even off the heels of the Turbo movie, which is far less nostalgic, but in my opinion better than the first film, it was a losing battle. To the point where not even Tommy himself wanted to see this season through. In fact, the only reason he was the Red Turbo Ranger at all was because Saban and friends negotiated a deal with JDF, thus giving them time to eventually find one TJ Johnson. And also for the record, the other not Justin Rangers were written off right alongside him because Saban did not want to pay them more. For some old school fans, this might very well have been the last straw. Even though the overall cast and acting abilities were vastly improved after the power transfer, Tommy was and still is the face of the franchise, and even though I've given high praise to Cassie, Ashley, and TJ, there was no way to know at the time if any of them would have worked out, and if they didn't, they would have gone down in history as effectively ending the Power Rangers. And that fate was almost inevitable, to the point where even if TJ gave a performance akin to a modern-day Michael B. Jordan, low ratings might still have given us the classic case of too little, too late. Because of all the factors I just explained, and plenty more, In Space was supposed to be the last hurrah, the final fight for the Rangers, as a team and as a TV show. But one thing I've always believed is that the true worth of something or someone is not what one does when things are going great, just like in '94 for example, but rather what happens when your back is against the wall. That was the initial state of In Space. So, how did that all turn out? Well, let's take a closer look and now finally break down why and how In Space saved the franchise. We start things off continuing on from where Turbo left us. Divatox and her goons destroyed both Turbo Megazords as well as the power chamber, and on top of that, Zordon was being held prisoner by the League of somewhat extraordinary villains. We can hold it right there. There's an entire allegiance of otherworldly villains out there, all vying to take down the Rangers and Zordon. That's exactly how you start a season with space in the title. And what's more, Astronema's cold, perfect introduction, firmly presenting herself as a villain head and shoulders above the whinier antagonists of yesteryear. Within 2 minutes, you could just feel how different this ride was gonna be. And then we get the Red Ranger himself, the perfect new addition to an otherwise familiar roster of recurring Rangers. It's made clear that he's been fighting and spying on his own for a long while now, and we later start to uncover why, although we really do have to infer other aspects of his past. For example, who were the Space Rangers before TJ and the gang joined? My simple theory? Zane survived, but they didn't, thus giving us the foundation for Andros' initial trust issues and somewhat reserved personality. But he quickly learns that the only sensible way to stop Astronema and save Zordon is for the Power Rangers of Earth to suit back up. There are so many layers to finding from out of nowhere. The big daddy of villainy himself, known as Dark Spectre, the perfection of the Queen of Darkness herself, and the idea of serialized storytelling. That last point is one of the more vital ones, and will likely keep coming back to it. But most of all, in space was Rangers finally embracing their true nature as a galactic entity, and not just an earthbound one. With Triforia, Aquitar, Edenoi, and Zordon himself being from Eltar, we got teases to that wider universe. But now, we have a true-to-form alien ranger in the main cast of a real season. And now, instead of having weekly soap operas, we get weekly space operas. Space operas with multiple layers to unveil and unpackage. Everything about the in-space opening was meant to inform us that things wouldn't just be different, but better. Much better. And after the first 15 or so episodes, if not much sooner, it'll pull you in and won't let you go. And I know I mentioned it in a previous video, but it bears repeating. TJ not taking the reins of this new team in favor of a guy that's been there and done that was a smart and classy move. Neither him nor anyone else on the old Turbo team knew anything about the worlds beyond Earth. Heck, none of them even expected to become superheroes before the power transfer happened. Despite his initial hesitation to even take on a team, Andros needed to be the one to lead it. And as far as internal team dynamics go, this also presents us with the beautifully awkward start to one of the best depicted romances in the franchise. They weren't just improving some things here, oh no, they were looking to improve everything. Going back to the serialized storytelling point I mentioned before, notice that the plots and problems of the season opener become highlighted in episode 3, Save Our Ship. Not only do the Rangers address the damaged Astro megaship from the previous episode, but they also emphasize Andros' need to acclimate himself to his new team, but especially to Ashley because her crush is beyond obvious even at this point. This was something most previous seasons could never effectively do. For example, after the Turbo power transfer, you have a team of Rangers that barely know each other now, but in the very next episode, they oddly chose to not focus on building a brand new team and the setbacks thereof. Instead, they take the shortcut of pretending that these people have been friends for at least a while now, despite Cassie and TJ not even living here originally. And then, Ashley's jacket becomes a problem and yeah, not a great episode. But here, we already see plot threads seamlessly moving through the show until they really are resolved. And by doing that, this team and this season is able to progress more naturally, step by step, before we get to the much larger plot points when Zane enters the picture and Astronema's truth is uncovered. There are still a couple of one-off episodes in there that don't ultimately end up mattering, but it's much fewer and far between. Case in point, as early as episode 4, Never Stop Searching, we get the pinnacle of all plot threads, the season-long narrative that is Korra. In episode 7 and beyond, we see holodeck technology being used so that the Rangers can actually hone their skills, while also fully embracing the Star Trek motif they're heavily influenced by. And in episode 10, Wasp of a Heart, we get a season highlight from Cassie as the emotional centerpiece, but it also speaks to the much larger, much more important point about alien life in general. Not all of it is trying to kill you, even the ones that look like they could. A simple yet powerful social concept that s.p.d. would later build on to great success. This is the in-space foundation. So, when you do end up getting somewhat random episodes like Grandma Matchmaker, it's harder to see those as issues. In fact, I thought that particular episode was hilarious. But part of that is also context, since the vast majority of In Space is darker and smarter in tone than that episode, so it serves as a perfect break from the heavier plot points. Speaking of heavier plot points, let's dig a little deeper into Darkonda and what his early involvement sets up. Never Stop Searching gives us our initial peek into the tragedy of Korra. As a helpless child, she was stolen away by Darkonda himself and forced into a life she never chose. And if that's not the best villain origin story in Ranger history, then I'm not sure what is. But what's also important here are the character dynamics that emerge from it. enter Ecliptor, one of the all-time best side villains to ever grace my television screen. Darkonda seems like just another boisterous villain at first, but he is all types of sneaky smart. And in the Beryllian Sting, he maneuvers his way into Astronema's crew, all while fully knowing what he did to her years ago. But what we also then see from him is a brewing rivalry with Space Daddy himself. Why? Because the show knows what the reveal will eventually be, so they purposely made it so that Ecliptor has a problem with Darkonda, because despite being a machine, and despite also keeping her past a secret, he genuinely cares about Astronema. Ecliptor knows what Darkonda did, and Darkonda even uses Astronema's past to blackmail Ecliptor, but even while in the service of evil, he still wants nothing more but to end Darkonda, his own way of saying, "You put my pseudo-daughter through hell, so now I'm gonna send you there myself." And all of this well before Astronema thinks twice, both the episode and the literal action. With this, we have another all-time high in the way some not-so-simple villains are trying to out-scheme each other, and it's beautifully done. Something else that happens gradually here is the Rangers leaving the high school life behind, and then going on to completely ignore the idea of teenagers with attitude for several seasons after the fact, and that singular decision is one of the best the franchise has ever made. Not because there's anything inherently wrong with younger Rangers, but because that was part of the staleness that was emphasized with Turbo during its lowly run. To tell different types of stories, you need different types of people with different experiences, different professions, different ages. This adds several unexplored dimensions to the Ranger narrative, as directly opposed to, "Oh no, a math test, wah." In short, taking inspiration exclusively from high school is a perfect way to become really boring really quickly. So, In Space slowly veers away from that by understanding how absurd it is that school would ever come before saving the embodiment of galactic good. Not to undersell the importance of school, of course, I work in education and consider learning the single greatest necessity in a proper society. But it just doesn't make as much sense to spend time on that when the Space Rangers, true to their name, simply aren't on Earth as much. This underlying idea also worked well for Bulk and Skull this season, who had their ever-changing real-world responsibilities adjusted accordingly. And now, instead of trying to unveil the Rangers, they work with the Nutty Professor Phenomenus to try and unveil alien life forms. The irony being that since Zane reveals himself to the masses during Countdown, technically they accomplish both goals. But we'll talk plenty about Countdown to Destruction later on. But before we highlight the endpoints of this incredible opening foundation in Part 2, we kind of have to talk about the not-so-incredible team-up episode that is Shell Shocked. Firstly, yes, this really was a thing that happened. And secondly, I find the whole ordeal more of an interesting case study than the excruciating experience that it was for some. You see, I thought this crossover was a great idea, in theory. The most noteworthy team of 80s superheroes teaming up with the most noteworthy team of 90s superheroes? How could anyone screw that up? Well, figuring out that involves understanding that the next mutation likely stands as the most reviled Turtle show of all time. There was no Casey Jones, no April O'Neil, the Turtles apparently weren't biological brothers for some stupid reason, which then gave the showrunners all the justification they needed to have their not-sister Venus positioned for potential romance with her not-brothers, thus unknowingly inspiring an entire subgenre of anime years later. Probably. Also, Venus herself was a pretty terribly conceived character on top of that, which is strange because this Turtle show was also owned by Saban, but Venus is a far cry removed from the wonderfully constructed female protagonists Saban has given us, including the two from this season. So knowing all that, it makes the team up a whole lot less viable, but they still could have at least used this chance to inject these turtles with the personalities that they're known for. But even the signature character traits of cool but rude, party dude, does machines, and leader don't seem to apply much to this bunch. Again, probably just another carryover from a bad show that I honestly don't remember in great detail outside of what I researched. So this ended up making the crossover turtles, who by design aren't especially complex characters, even more hollow as a result. Even Michael Bay's middling TMNT movies got that right to a degree. So for as horrible as some people claim this crossover to be, to the point of not even considering it canon, I think its biggest sin is simply not being special. and not good on top of that. It's an episode that looks like a crossover, but feels more like Andros and the Stowaway. Viper is a pretty lame villain, and didn't add much to the Time for Lightspeed crossover, but the idea of villains scheming together was prevalent enough here to be a theme in and of itself, so a lot could have been forgiven if Astronema had teamed up with the Shredder. Instead, what we got felt like a half-assed way to plug Saban's other show, which he's done before with Masked Rider, but that Mighty Morphin storyline was allowed to breathe with multiple parts and was far more compelling at least. And overall, Shell Shock stands out like an oddly shaped scar on the back of an otherwise great season. And in part 2, we'll dive deeper into what made it great, as we analyze Astronema, the Psycho Rangers, and the legendary back half of In Space that still easily holds up today. And until then, thanks for watching.